My parents didn't just kick me out of the house on Thanksgiving. They erased my existence because of a stolen blueprint. Milas sneered as I was thrown into a deadly blizzard with only a tattered backpack and a broken past. But an hour later, the snow in Chicago turned crimson. 21 red limousines didn't just find me. They activated a sleeping empire that Irene Hayes was born to lead. Before the air raid sirens blared and the colossal debt screamed, before the high society dinner became their funeral, it all began with a calculated silence at the table. I stood at the threshold of the grand dining room, my hands still radiating a dull, throbbing heat from the kitchen. The scent of roasted turkey and rosemary cloyed in the air, a thick, suffocating perfume that masked the underlying rot of this house. In Lake Forest, Thanksgiving wasn't a holiday. It was a high-stakes performance. I looked at the table, my architectural mind involuntarily scanning the room for structural integrity. The bone-white china was perfectly aligned. The silver was polished to a blinding glint. Yet, I could see the stress fractures in the way my father sat, the hollow resonance in my mother's laughter. I realized then that in this mansion of stone and ego, I had always been the non-load-bearing daughter. I was the one they tucked away in the corners, a shadow permitted to exist only if I remained silent. Have you ever stood in a room full of your own blood and felt like a ghost? It is a peculiar kind of cold, one that starts in the marrow and refuses to thaw. "Irene, the wine isn't going to pour itself," my sister Malis remarked without looking at me. Her voice was thin, like a wire being pulled too tight. She was draped in silk that cost more than my first 2 years of college, her eyes fixed on her reflection in a silver spoon. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. I simply reached for the decanter, my movements fluid and practiced. I had learned long ago that in this family, silence was the only armor that didn't rust. My mother, Vespera, adjusted her pearls, her gaze skating over me as if I were a smudge on the wallpaper. "Your sister had a big win today, Irene. Real results, not like those sketches you keep in your studio." I felt my knuckles whiten against the glass. I didn't say that those sketches were actually winning awards. I didn't say that I was building a life they couldn't understand. I just leaned down, my fingers grazing the cold silk of Vespera's shawl. "Happy Thanksgiving, Mom," I whispered. I believe that kindness is a bridge we build even if the other side refuses to walk across. Looking back now, I should have seen that they had already begun to dismantle the other side. The atmosphere shifted when Maëlys clinked her crystal flute against her plate. The sound was sharp, a warning bell before a structural collapse. "I have an announcement," she said, her smile broadening into something predatory. "The Chicago Museum project? The board chose my firm. We start the foundation work in January." My heart didn't just drop, it stopped. I knew those plans. I had spent 3 years, thousands of midnight hours, and every ounce of my creative soul perfecting those blueprints. I had kept them in a locked safe in my private studio, or so I thought. Milas reached into her designer clutch and pulled out a glossy portfolio, sliding it across the mahogany. There they were. My lines, my cantilevers, my soul, rebranded with her name in bold gold leaf. "I found these interesting," Maëlys continued, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. "But even more interesting was the memo I found attached to them. It seems our dear Irene was planning to sell these exact designs to our biggest competitor for a kickback." She tossed a forged document onto the table, a letter with my digital signature clearly visible. My father, Cyprian, slammed his hand down, making the silverware dance a frantic rhythmic jig. "Is this true?" he roared. I didn't flinch. I didn't scream. I sat there observing the slight tremor in Milas's left hand, the telltale sign of a shaky foundation. I remembered a philosophy I once read. The strongest steel is forged in the hottest fire, but a hollow beam will always snap under the weight of its own lies. I looked her in the eye, my voice as steady as stone. "I am disappointed not that you took my work, Maëlys. I am disappointed that you think my talent is something that can be stolen." The room went silent, a heavy, expectant void. I could feel the eyes of the family, the people who were supposed to be my sanctuary, turning into cold, unyielding blades. Cyprian didn't ask for my side. He didn't want the truth. He wanted a reason to do what he had been planning for months. He reached into his breast pocket and slid a single thick envelope towards me. "Termination of support," he said, the words falling like heavy debris. "Your professional misconduct has compromised the Hayes name. To save our reputation, I am disinheriting you. Effective immediately." I looked at the papers. It wasn't just a loss of money. It was an eviction from my own life. Vespera nodded in cold agreement. "We have to maintain family honor, Irene. You've become a liability." They pushed a second document toward me. A peaceful exit agreement, they called it. My architect's eyes scanned the fine print, the legal jargon hiding a jagged trap. It was a forged gift deed, a document surrendering my rights to the ancestral land my mother had secretly left me. "Sign it, and we won't press charges for the theft," Cyprian commanded. I picked up the pen. My name, Irene, looked small and fragile on the white page. But as the ink dried, I didn't feel the panic I expected. I felt a surge of quiet power. For the first time in my life, I wasn't being managed. I was being released. By taking everything, they had accidentally granted me the most dangerous gift of all. Total freedom from their expectations. I stood up, my silhouette a sharp, defiant anchor against the white linens. "Irene, this place is not yours. Get out of here," Miley's hissed, her smirk finally breaking into a grin of victory. I leaned into Cyprian, my voice a whisper that cut through the silence. "I am signing this not because I am guilty, but because I refuse to belong to a house that is built on theft." I walked toward the door, not looking back at the dinner that was now awake. I didn't need their silver. I didn't need their approval. I didn't realize it then, but that moment changed everything. To be loved for a lie is a slow death. To be hated for the truth is the beginning of freedom. I felt the cold air of the hallway hit my face, a stark contrast to the stifling heat of the dining room. I grabbed my old torn backpack from the foyer, the one I had used since college, its seams straining with the few things I called mine. I reached for the heavy oak handle, the weight of the door feeling like the closing of a tomb. The sound vibrated beneath my shoes like the final hammer blow of a judge executing a death sentence. I stood alone in the hallway, my shadow instantly swallowed by the swirling white expanse of the Chicago blizzard. The warmth of the kitchen had become a fading memory, replaced by a sharp, blade-like wind cutting into my flesh. Looking back at the brightly lit dining room windows, I realized that a house is merely an expensive cage if the people inside have hearts carved from permafrost. I adjusted the straps of my tattered backpack. Its weight suddenly became my only remaining anchor in a world that had just decided I no longer existed. Have you ever been pushed out into the darkness by the very people who were supposed to be your beacon? I began to walk, my architectural mind involuntarily calculating the freezing point of my own spirit. Every mansion I passed in Lake Forest looked like a sterile monument to a success I no longer shared. My breath came in ragged plumes of frost as I reached the gated community's exit, the iron bars clicking shut behind me with a cold, mechanical finality. I wasn't just leaving a neighborhood, I was being purged from a bloodline. I kept moving because standing still meant surrendering to the ice. I found myself at St. James Square, the small public park now a desolate landscape of bone-white trees and howling wind. I collapsed onto an iron bench under a flickering street lamp, my fingers so numb I could barely unzip my pack. That was when the true cold hit me. Hidden at the bottom of the bag, I found the only photo I had left of my late mother. Her smile, the only warmth I had carried through years of isolation. But as I pulled it out, my heart shattered. Milas hadn't just stolen my career. She had systematically shredded the photo into tiny, jagged confetti. It was a symbolic execution, a message that my last anchor to the past had been erased. I sat there in the middle of the blizzard, the scraps of my mother's face fluttering in my palm like dead leaves. I didn't scream. I didn't give them the satisfaction of my tears. I gathered the fragments and pressed them against my chest, right over my heart. They can destroy the paper, but they cannot demolish the memory of the woman who taught me to stand tall. Through the thick curtain of snow, I heard the slow, rhythmic scrape of footsteps. A man emerged from the fog, ragged, hunched, his skin a translucent gray that looked like it had been claimed by the frost long ago. This was Silas. He moved with a strange, measured grace that didn't belong to a man of the streets. His eyes sharp even as his body shivered. He stopped a few feet away, his bare feet pasted purple against the concrete. Something inside me cracked open. I looked at my silk scarf, the last designer item I owned, a remnant of the Irene they wanted to bury, and I didn't hesitate. I knelt in the snow and wrapped the warm fabric around his bleeding feet. True nobility isn't found in a bank account, Silas. It's in the hands that reach out when they have nothing left to give. Silas looked down at me, his breath a slow, heavy mist. He tried to refuse the scarf, his voice a rough whisper. "You need this more than I do, child," he said. But I shook my head, my resolve hardening like the ice around us. "I have a fire inside me they couldn't put out," I replied. "You need the warmth more." Silas watched me for a long moment, an unreadable understanding passing between us. Then, he reached into the folds of his tattered coat and handed me his own umbrella. A broken, battered thing held together by duct tape and hope. "Take this," he whispered. "It's more than it looks." As I opened the umbrella, a small, heavy object fell from a hidden pocket in the lining, a ruby ring. It caught the yellow light of the street lamp, glowing with a visceral, crimson intensity that seemed to vibrate in my palm. My breath hitched. This wasn't just jewelry. It was the biometric key to my mother's secret trust, the umbrella codicil Silas had been guarding for decades. He leaned in, whispering a phrase only my mother and I had ever shared in the privacy of her garden. "The foundation is laid, Irene. Now, you must build." In that second, I realized that Silas wasn't a random stranger. He was a living vault, a protector who had been waiting for the daughter who would choose kindness over her own survival. I looked at the ring, then back at Silas's weathered face. I couldn't leave him. Even with a fortune in my hand, the thought of walking away while he suffered was a structural failure I couldn't allow. "Stay with me," I told him, shielding him from the wind with his own broken umbrella. "We wait together." I sat back on the bench, my posture shifting from a victim to a protector. I reflected on the nature of value, realizing that a storm doesn't break the ocean. It only tests the strength of the surface. My family's cruelty was the very fire needed to reveal my hidden worth. Kindness isn't in what we have, but what we dare to share when we are at our absolute zero. We sat there in a silence that felt heavy and expectant. The blizzard intensified, the wind whipping around us in a frantic dance, but I didn't feel the cold anymore. I felt the quiet power of a soul reclaimed. Silas told me to wait exactly 1 hour at the center of the square. I sat with my backpack at my feet, the torn umbrella tilted to catch the worst of the gale, my eyes fixed on the dark road ahead. The vibration in the ground grew from a faint hum to a rhythmic thud, a mechanical heartbeat that seemed to pulse and sync with the blood rushing through my ears. I sat on that frozen iron bench, my knuckles white as I gripped the handle of Silas's torn umbrella. The wind howled, trying to tear the thin fabric from my hands. But I held firm, tilting it to shield the man who had shown me more mercy in 5 minutes than my parents had in 28 years. My breath came in shallow, frosting plumes, and the ruby ring on my finger caught the pale, flickering light of the street lamp. It looked like a drop of liquid fire against the bone-white snow. I looked down at my frozen limbs, but I didn't feel the numbness anymore. My mind was busy elsewhere, scanning the internal blueprint of my life, identifying the stress fractures and the load-bearing lies. The Hayes family had only ever seen the shell, the quiet youngest daughter who existed to be polished and displayed. They never bothered to check the structural steel within. Looking back now, I realize that true character is a lantern that glows brightest when the world is at its absolute darkest. Silas trembled violently beside me, his gray skin appearing almost translucent under the harsh winter light. I leaned in, my voice steady despite the chattering of my teeth. "Just a little longer, Silas. The storm is loud, but it isn't permanent." I reached into my backpack and pulled out the last granola bar I had, a crushed, humble thing I'd been saving. I didn't think about my own empty stomach. I didn't think about how I might not eat again for days. I simply broke it in half and pressed the larger piece into his frozen hand. "Eat," I urged. "We are just 2 people under a broken roof, Silas, but as long as we have each other, this storm has no power over us." He looked at me with those ancient knowing eyes, and for a second, the blizzard seemed to vanish. I realized then that I wasn't just a victim of a family feud. I was a participant in a much larger test of the soul. Exactly 60 minutes past midnight, the silence of Lake Forest was shattered. It started as a low growl that vibrated in my chest, then escalated into the synchronized roar of high-performance engines. Out of the thick, icy fog, a fleet of 21 identical red limousines emerged, their crimson paint looking like flowing blood against the pristine Chicago snow. They didn't just arrive, they invaded. The fleet moved with tactical precision, surrounding the square in a perfect circle, their LED headlights cutting through the blizzard like blinding laser beams. The snow hissed as it hit the hot engines. I stood up, the torn umbrella still in my hand, as the lead car's rear door swung open with a soft, expensive thud. Kalen stepped out, dressed in a sharp black wool coat, his eyes finding mine instantly. He didn't say a word. He simply bowed, a deep, respectful gesture that acknowledged a queen, not a runaway. Silas stood up beside me, his ragged, hunched posture suddenly straightening into a sharp, professional authority. The transformation was breathtaking. "The Crimson Protocol is active, Irene," he said, his voice no longer rough with cold, but resonant with power. He revealed the truth that had been buried for decades, the Red Shield Group. It wasn't just a foundation. It was a massive private security and financial conglomerate my mother had built in the shadows, hidden from my father's greed. These 21 cars represented the 21 years of integrity she demanded I prove through my own trials. I looked at the ruby ring, realizing it was more than jewelry. It was a biometric key to a dormant empire that had been waiting for its architect. The shock of it hit me like a physical blow. A breathtaking high of secret vindication that made the freezing air feel like oxygen for the first time. Kalen stepped forward, his hand extended toward the open door. "The Hayes Mansion is only 3 miles away, Irene. We can be there in 5 minutes. We can end this tonight." I looked toward the distant glowing lights of the house that had cast me out, my mind already calculating the move, but I raised my hand, stopping him. The loudest person in the room is often the most fragile, but the quietest is the one holding the keys. If I went back now, I would just be another player in their drama. I needed to be the one who wrote the script. "No," I said, my voice cold and focused. "We don't go back, not yet." I made the intellectual choice to vanish, to let Milas and Cyprian believe their victory was absolute. Arrogance is a structural flaw. I would let them build their lies so high that the eventual collapse would be unavoidable. I turned to Silas, making sure he was placed in the warmest car with a medical team already waiting inside. "Take care of him," I told Kalen. "He offered me a roof when my own blood offered me a storm. He is never to be invisible again." Silas gripped my hand one last time, a silent covenant sealed between us. I realized that the people who save you are rarely the ones you expect. I stepped into the limousine, the scent of expensive leather and cedar filling my lungs, a stark contrast to the smell of wet wool and despair I had carried just an hour ago. My suitcase hit the plush floor with a hollow thud, a sound that echoed the closing of my old life. As the fleet pulled away in silent, synchronized unison, the crimson taillights faded into the Chicago fog. I leaned back into the shadows of the car, my silhouette framed by the red glow of the interior lights. I looked back at the square, then at the distant dark silhouette of the Hayes Mansion. I didn't feel hatred. I didn't feel the need for a screaming confrontation. I felt a profound, chilling serenity. I wasn't leaving because I was weak, or because I had been defeated. I was leaving to build a foundation they could never shake. There are silences that aren't surrender, but a return to oneself to prepare for a much bigger storm. I didn't know what the next few months would hold, but as I touched the ruby ring, I knew the unwanted daughter was gone. The architect had arrived. The Chicago skyline shimmered in the distance like a blueprint for a new world, every light a possibility, every shadow a secret I now owned. I watched the snow lash against the tinted glass, realizing that Milas's smirk and my father's gavel-like voice were now just background noise in a much grander composition. I had been erased from their family tree, but I had been written into a legacy they couldn't even imagine. The mission for my mother's honor had officially begun, and I wouldn't stop until every stone they had placed on my back was used to build their own prison. The rhythmic hum of the Chicago traffic outside Silas's high-security law office felt like a complex circuit board, a digital mirror to the legal war I was preparing to wage. I sat in the dim light of the mahogany-paneled room, my eyes fixed on the fireproof safe in the corner. Silas moved with a deliberate, practiced stillness, his footsteps silent on the thick Persian rug. When he finally pulled out the leather-bound original trust ledger, the scent of aged parchment and bitter ink flooded the space. It was the smell of a forgotten era, grounding our high-tech battle in a heavy, historical weight. I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly as I touched my mother's firm, elegant signature on the first page. I could feel the structural integrity of her love in those lines. While Cyprian and Melis had spent years building a house of mirrors and glass, my mother had been quietly pouring a foundation of solid stone just for me. I realized then that I hadn't been forgotten. I had been shielded. Silas slid a series of thick folders toward me, their tabs labeled with the Hayes family's private financial entities. "They've been hemorrhaging cash for years, Irene," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Cyprian is drowning in high-interest debt, and Milas is using the museum project as a personal ATM. I scanned the numbers, my hands resting flat on the desk. I felt a cold, clinical calm wash over me. I didn't feel the urge to scream or the fire of immediate revenge. I felt the weight of acceptance. The most expensive thing in the world is a cheap character. It costs you everything in the end. Looking back now, I should have seen the rot in their books long before they threw me out. I turned to Silas, my gaze steady. "Thank you for staying in the shadows for so long, Silas. I know what it cost you." I made a silent promise that the Red Shield Group would prioritize the pensions of the family's longtime staff, the gardeners, the maids, the people Miley's was planning to cut to save a few dollars. Power is only truly valuable if it is used to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Kaylin tapped the screen of my laptop, bringing up the architectural layers of the Chicago Museum project, the one Miley's had so proudly displayed at Thanksgiving. "The city council is moving fast," he warned. "They're breaking ground in 48 hours. I leaned in, my expert eyes scanning the structural layers I had spent 3 years perfecting. My heart skipped a beat, but not from fear. I spotted it instantly. A fatal structural flaw in the foundation design. It was a load-bearing miscalculation I had intentionally left in my earliest drafts as a security test. A trap for anyone who tried to build without understanding the physics behind the art. Miley's, in her desperate rush to steal my glory, had literally stolen a blueprint for a disaster. The building was destined for a tectonic collapse before the 3rd floor was even reached. Kaylin looked at me, his jaw tight. "We should report this to the City Building Commission now. We can humiliate her publicly before she even puts a shovel in the ground." I sat back, the ruby ring catching a glint of the overhead light. I didn't realize it then, but this was the moment I stopped being a victim and started being a commander. "No," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We wait. A lie doesn't just collapse on the truth, it eventually collapses on the person who told it. If I stopped her now, she would find a way to blame a subordinate or a contractor. But if I let her continue, she would be the one standing on the cracked foundation when the inspectors arrived. I chose the path of patient justice. I wouldn't descend to their level of petty sabotage. I would let the law of gravity do the work for me." Silas then pulled out the land deed for the Hayes mansion in Lake Forest, the original parchment from 1968. He pointed to a specific paragraph, his finger tracing the integrity clause my mother had insisted upon. My breath hitched as I read the legal jargon. The land, the very soil the mansion sat on, was never truly Cyprian's. It had been held in a blind trust for the youngest daughter, a sovereign boundary that my father had no legal right to touch. But there was a condition. The land reversion was only triggered if I was dishonorably removed from the family home without just cause. By kicking me out on Thanksgiving with nothing but a torn backpack, Cyprian hadn't just gotten rid of a daughter. On had accidentally triggered his own eviction. The intellectual pivot was dizzying. According to U.S. property law, the improvements on the land, the house itself, belonged to the trust. Milas and Cyprian were essentially squatters on my property. I realized that my mother didn't just leave me money. She left me a standard of honor they were too blind to see. "I am not taking back a house," I told Silas, my voice reflecting a cold, sharp high of secret vindication. "I am reclaiming a legacy they chose to abandon." I picked up the fountain pen, the weight of it feeling like a weapon. I signed the claim of reversion in the same firm, elegant style as my mother, officially starting the final countdown for the Hayes family. Revenge is a fire that burns the one who starts it. Justice is a light that simply reveals what was always there. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, the gold-embossed deed in my hand, a silent promise that the unwanted daughter was about to become the landlord of her family's reality. The Chicago skyline shimmered below me, no longer a daunting maze, but a structural challenge I was ready to solve. For the first time in my life, I wasn't panicking. I was free. I had been erased from their dinner table, but I had been written into a foundation they couldn't even imagine. My name, Irene Hayes, didn't mean shadow anymore. It meant accountability. I watched my reflection in the glass, the ruby ring glowing like a warning light. "Emma, this place is not yours," Milas had said. She was right. This place wasn't mine. The whole city was. That's where it all started. The transition from a girl who was cast out to a woman who owned the ground was almost complete. I turned away from the window, the blueprint of the mansion folded neatly in my pocket. Tomorrow, the city would wake up to a new reality, and the people who thought they could bury me would find out that I was the one who designed the tomb. The wind whipped across the Chicago Museum site, a biting, clinical cold that smelled of wet concrete and impending triumph. I watched the scene through the high-definition security feed in Silas's office, my architectural mind dissecting the stage my sister had built. Miley stood at the podium, a sharp silhouette in a custom-tailored power suit that screamed authority. She held the golden shovel like a scepter and my stolen blueprints like holy relics. Flashing lights from 100 cameras bounced off the polished surface of the podium, creating a halo of artificial success. I leaned back in my chair, my hands resting flat on the mahogany desk, feeling the rhythmic escalation of the storm outside. I realized she wasn't just building a museum, she was building a skyscraper of lies. Looking back now, I should have realized she was always better at acting than laying foundations. Miley suddenly deviated from her rehearsed speech, her voice dropping to a somber, theatrical tone. "Before we break ground, I must address a painful family matter," she announced, her eyes glistening with fake tears for the front row. She pressed a button, and a distorted audio clip echoed across the site. It was a forged recording. My voice, digitally altered to sound frantic and dangerous, making it seem like I was threatening to bomb the very ground we stood on. "My sister Irene is currently a shadow of her former self," Milas continued, looking directly into the main camera lens. "She has become a mentally unstable liability, attempting to destroy the family's legacy because she couldn't handle her own failures." I felt a sharp, cold sting in my chest, but I didn't flinch. I sat perfectly still, observing how she utilized my absence to strengthen her own structural integrity. It was a masterclass in public execution. My phone began to vibrate incessantly on the desk, notifications from former colleagues, friends, and professional contacts disowning me in real time. I didn't realize it then, but this viral stoning was exactly what I needed to see. It revealed the people who were merely wallpaper in my life and those who were load-bearing pillars. Have you ever watched your own reputation burn and felt a strange, chilling serenity? I turned to Silas, my voice as steady as a structural beam. "I will not burn the house down just to see them choke on the smoke," I whispered. "I will let the truth be the only judge." The room was stifling, a steady compression, echoing each time a hateful comment appeared on the screen. Kaylin paced back and forth behind me, grinding her teeth with the frustration of a warrior. "They're conducting a health check at the last known address, Irene. She's trying to get you into a mental hospital before the end of the day." I wasn't afraid. A woman didn't need to raise her voice to be heard. She raised the standard for truth to the point where lies had no place to exist. I instructed Silas to transmit my biometric wedding record log, GPS and heart rate data from Thanksgiving night proving I was in the park with Silas, not at the locations Milas had described in her police report. I wasn't making excuses. I was simply diverting the investigation back to its source. As Milas plunged the golden shovel into the dirt, I began my own stealth maneuver. While she celebrated her glory, I sent a clinical notice of structural liability directly to the city's building inspectors and the project's primary insurance underwriters. I didn't include a personal message. I only attached the digital scan of the foundation design Milas had stolen, highlighting the intentional load-bearing miscalculation I had left as a security test. I knew that once those underwriters saw the math, the funding would freeze faster than the Chicago River in January. I also triggered an automatic federal financial audit by revealing the source of the gala funds, money Milas had illegally diverted from the dormant Red Shield accounts I now controlled. I stood up from the desk, my eyes reflecting the cold red lights of the server room. The transition was complete. I was no longer the invisible daughter being hunted. I was the phantom architect dismantling the enemy from within. "Let them have their party today," I said, my silhouette sharp against the blue light of the monitors. "Tomorrow they find out who owns the ground they stand on." I felt a surge of quiet power, a breathtaking high of secret vindication that no amount of social media hatred could touch. Integrity is the only thing that cannot be stolen, only surrendered, and I never surrendered. The camera zoomed in on my reflection in the glass. I looked different. The girl who had been cast out with a torn backpack was buried beneath layers of tactical resolve and clinical stoicism. I touched the ruby ring, the biometric key to an empire Milas didn't even know existed. "Aye. Emma, this place is not yours," she had mocked. She was half right. The mansion wasn't my home anymore. It was my first acquisition. I watched the red flags bloom across the banking interface, realizing that my mother's red trust was finally doing the work it was designed for. Milas's celebration was just a champagne toast on the deck of a sinking ship, and I was the one who had already pulled the plug. The sharp pain in my chest had vanished, replaced by a cold, focused energy. I had been erased from their family, but I was about to be etched into the city's history as the woman who had stood her ground. There are silences that aren't surrenders. They're meant to make it clear that your heart has hardened like diamond. I pulled on my coat and turned toward the door, leaving the digital storm behind. The silent daughter was about to become the loudest voice in the room, and I didn't need a microphone for them to hear me. I smoothed the front of my charcoal suit, my posture a straight line of unbreakable discipline. Inside the grand ballroom, the scent of expensive lilies and vintage champagne masked the underlying rot of a dynasty built on stolen ground. Milas and Cyprian were at the center of a sparkling circle, performing a masterpiece of choreographed success for the city's elite. They laughed, they toasted, and they lied, entirely unaware that the foundation beneath their feet had already been dismantled. Looking back now, I should have seen it coming. The way a house built on debt is merely a temporary stage. I watched them from the base of the grand staircase, my architectural mind involuntarily scanning the room for stress fractures. I could see the slight tremor in my father's hand as he held his glass, the hollow resonance in Milas's rehearsed laughter. Silas and Kaylin stood behind me, their presence a silent tactical anchor. I realized then that a lie told in a ballroom is still just a lie, no matter how many diamonds are covering it. The most expensive thing in the world is a cheap character. It costs you everything in the end. I didn't feel anger. I felt a surgical, cold precision. I paused to whisper a final instruction to Kaylin, ensuring the mansion's service staff, people who had seen me grow up while my parents ignored me, were moved to my private payroll effective immediately. Integrity means protecting the people who served your family, even when your family forgot their names. The music died a sudden, jarring death as the front doors swung open. 21 red limousines lined the driveway, their crimson headlights flooding through the tall windows and washing the ballroom in the color of a warning. I walked into the center of the room, my silhouette sharp and undeniable against the sudden silence. Cyprian stepped forward, his face a mask of confusion that quickly curdled into rage. "Irene, what is the meaning of this intrusion?" I didn't answer with words. I handed him the global notice of foreclosure, the heavy parchment feeling like a weapon in my hand. I had spent the last year utilizing every resource of the Red Shield to buy up 100% of his high-interest debts and the mansion's primary mortgage. I wasn't just the unwanted daughter anymore. I was their sole and direct creditor. Miley's pushed through the crowd, her diamond necklace, bought with the very trust funds she had forged my name to steal, glittering under the chandeliers. "You think you can just walk in here with some papers and claim this house?" she hissed, her voice cracking the sterile air. I looked her in the eye, my voice as steady as a structural beam. "You told me to see if I could survive without a foundation, Miley's. I did more than survive. I became the owner of the ground you are standing on." I watched the blood drain from her face as she realized the integrity clause had been activated. According to U.S. property law, their presence in this house was now officially classified as trespassing. I wasn't reclaiming a home, I was enforcing a boundary. Miley's frantically pulled out her phone, trying to start a live stream to paint me as the villain once again. "Look at her! My mentally unstable sister is trying to steal our parents' home," she shouted to her followers. But I was one step ahead. I nodded to Silas, who triggered a remote broadcast to every phone in the room and every screen on Melis's feed. The unedited footage from Thanksgiving night began to play. The clear, high-definition recording of Miley's smirking as she shredded our mother's photo, and Cyprian's flat voice disinheriting me for a crime they had committed. The viral stoning reversed in a heartbeat. I watched as the elite guests began to back away, their sympathy turning into a landslide of public fury against the Hayes name. The truth doesn't scream, it just waits for the noise to die down. The ballroom emptied faster than a building with a failed alarm. Miley's collapsed onto a velvet sofa, her influencer mask slipping to reveal a feral, ugly desperation. She sobbed, a loud and messy sound that echoed through the now empty hall. Cyprian stood frozen, his empire of glass finally shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. I walked to the door and held it open, my face a mask of clinical stoicism. "I am not doing this to hurt you, Melis," I said, my voice cutting through her cries. "I am doing this to stop you from hurting anyone else." I didn't feel joy in their suffering. I just felt the heavy, necessary weight of closure. Revenge is a fire that leaves you in ashes. Only justice allows you to rebuild on the truth. My own security team, dressed in the same crimson as the limousines, escorted my parents and sister toward the foyer. They walked past me like ghosts of a life I no longer recognized. My father didn't look back. My sister didn't say a word. I stood on the marble steps as the massive redwood doors finally closed behind them with a soft, final click. I touched the ruby ring on my finger, feeling the rhythmic pulse of the house settling into its new reality. For the first time in 28 years, the air in this mansion was finally clean. I didn't realize it then, but that silence was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I watched the massive redwood doors of my childhood home close behind them, realizing that while I had reclaimed the stone and the soil, the real architecture was just beginning, building a life where love wasn't a transaction. I turned back toward the grand ballroom, the lights dimming as the storm outside began to fade. I was the architect of my own destiny, and the ground beneath my feet was finally, undeniably mine. I stood in the center of the grand foyer, the morning sun streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows in long, golden ribbons that seemed to wash away the ghosts of the past year. I reached up and carefully unscrewed the heavy brass Hayes family crest from the oak doors, the metal feeling cold and hollow in my hands. In its place, I mounted a simple, elegant plaque. The umbrella. Looking back now, I should have seen it coming, the way a house is only truly standing when its walls are built to shelter others, not to imprison its owners in their own greed. I looked at the empty spaces on the walls where the expensive, stolen art once hung, realizing that true beauty is found in the absence of vanity. Silas and Kaylin stepped into the light, clutching the completed 501c3 injunction for their nonprofit organization. We had spent months dismantling the Hayes Empire, not for profit, but for a noble cause. I signed the donation section, my pen moving rhythmically and steadily as I officially transferred my entire $40 million fortune into a perpetual trust for homeless women and architects stripped of their licenses due to corruption. I refused to retain any room for personal gain. "I'm not taking this house back to own it," I told Kaylin, my voice a quiet but powerful declaration. "I'm taking it back to liberate it. The greatest legacy is not what you leave people, but the moral standards you leave in them." As the grand doors opened to admit the first group of residents, I did a final walkthrough of my mother's private study. In a hidden compartment of her mahogany desk, I found a small, hand-drawn sketch of me as a child, hidden away like a secret prayer. On the back, in her firm, elegant script, she had written, "To my Irene, the one who builds the stormproof soul." I felt a tear escape, but it wasn't one of pain. It was a deep, spiritual resonance. The foundation was finally solid. I realized then that my mother's red trust was never about the money. It was a test to see if I had the strength to stand alone. The silence of the house was interrupted by a commotion at the front gate. I walked to the entrance and saw Miley's, Cyprian, and Vespera standing there, looking like shadows of their former selves. They had exhausted their legal appeals, and their bank accounts were as empty as their promises. Silas informed them that as part of their judicial restitution for forgery and wire fraud, they had been sentenced to 2,000 hours of community service. Right here, at the foundation. "Irene, this place is not yours," Milas had once shouted. Now she was standing at the threshold, begging for a room. I looked at her, not with anger, but with a clinical, steady compassion. "I will not trade my integrity for your regret," I told them, my voice calm but unyielding. I handed them cleaning supplies and pointed toward the kitchen and the laundry room. Miley's tried to beg for her old bedroom, but I simply shook my head. Forgiveness doesn't mean reopening the door that hurt you, Milas. It means providing a new door for you to learn how to be human again. I wasn't being cruel. I was giving them the only ladder out of the bottom. Honest work. I watched them walk toward the service entrance, realizing that the most expensive thing in the world is a cheap character, and they were finally paying the bill. I walked out onto the balcony overlooking Lake Michigan, the sunset painting the water in shades of crimson and violet. I held the original torn umbrella Silas had given me that night in the blizzard. I had patched the holes with red silk, turning a symbol of desperation into a banner of resilience. Kalen stood beside me, his hand finding mine. "We built it, Irene," he whispered. I looked at him and realized that real family isn't DNA. It's the people who stand in the rain with you when everyone else is inside celebrating your loss. I watched a young girl, a new resident, playing in the rose garden below, and I knew that the red trust had finally found its true purpose. A bird sitting on a tree is never afraid of the branch breaking because her trust is not in the branch, but in her own wings. I looked at my reflection in the glass one last time. The invisible daughter was gone. In her place stood a woman who had dismantled a dynasty to save her soul. I didn't win by being loud. I won by being undeniable. The mission for my mother's name was over, but the life of Irene was finally beginning under a clearer sky. I felt the breeze catch my dress, a sensation of total, breathtaking spiritual freedom. I didn't know what was waiting for me next, but I was ready. The camera pulls back, showing my silhouette against the Chicago skyline, a sharp, navy blue anchor against a sea of shimmering lights. I had reclaimed the stone and the soil, but more importantly, I had reclaimed myself. The lights of the city glittered like the blueprint of a new world, one where integrity was the only currency that mattered. I watched the sun dip below the horizon, realizing that every storm I had faced was simply the architect's way of ensuring the foundation was strong enough to support the future. I turned back into the warmth of the umbrella, the doors closing behind me with a soft, final sound that meant home. I realized that integrity is the only foundation no storm can shake. They thought they stole my future, but they gave me the freedom to build a world where love isn't a transaction. My name is Irene, and I've learned that you don't win by speaking the loudest. You win by being undeniable. If you've ever had to leave loved ones behind to find peace, please share your story in the comments below. I read all the comments,